Sometimes the most devastating crimes don't begin with screaming, violence, or any sign of danger at all. They begin quietly, almost silently, with something so small that it slips right past everyone's attention. Not with chaos, not with fear, but with a single message, a message that should never have existed, is a lie sent from a phone that belonged to a girl who was already gone. 17-year-old Bernadette Walker didn't just disappear. She slipped out of her world in a way that felt impossible, leaving behind a trail of confusion, panic, and questions that didn't seem to add up. And as the hours turned into days, and the days stretched into weeks, the truth that began to surface wasn't just tragic, it was deeply unsettling. Because the people who were supposed to protect her, support her, and speak up for her were the very ones weaving the story that hid what really happened. This is the case of Bernadette Walker, a case of silence, deception, and a secret that should have brought justice, but instead brought fear. Bernadette Walker was a 17-year-old photography student from Peterborough, the kind of teenager who carried her camera everywhere, capturing the subtle details of the world that most people overlooked. She had routines, ambitions, and a quiet, gentle way of moving through life. Teachers described her as thoughtful and considerate. Friends said she was creative, a little reserved, and deeply observant. The kind of person who noticed when someone was struggling and quietly tried to make them feel seen. She was not loud. She was not rebellious. She was not the type to draw attention to herself. In many ways, she was just normal. A girl learning to navigate school, friendships, and the uncertain path toward adulthood. But beneath that calm and soft-spoken exterior, Bernadette carried a burden no teenager should ever have to endure. For years, she had kept a terrifying secret, hidden behind polite smiles and ordinary conversations. A secret that quietly shaped her days and weighed on her mind more heavily than anyone around her could ever have imagined. That secret was the abuse she had been enduring at the hands of her stepfather, Scott Walker. A trauma she had suffered in silence, afraid, uncertain, and alone. For years, she had carried it silently, hoping perhaps that the nightmare would end on its own, or that speaking up might somehow make it worse. But in July 2020, Bernadette found a courage beyond her years. She finally confided in her mother, Sarah Walker, revealing the abuse she had endured behind closed doors. It was a moment that took unimaginable bravery. A teenage girl placing her trust in her mother, seeking protection, validation, and safety after years of suffering. She wanted someone to hear her. Someone to intervene, someone to believe her pain. The confession changed everything. The walls of secrecy began to crack. The fragile sense of safety she had clung to for so long vanished, replaced by fear, uncertainty, and a chain of events that would ultimately spiral into tragedy. That single act of courage, speaking the truth she had hidden for so long, became the turning point in a story that would leave the world stunned. Scott Walker was Bernadette's stepfather. Scott Walker was not just another adult in Bernadette's life. He was her stepfather, someone who had been present for many of her growing up years, and someone who, at least outwardly, seemed to fill the space of a parent. In most families, a step-parent eventually becomes a source of guidance and emotional support, someone a child can trust, depend on, and feel safe around. That is the role he should have played. But behind the ordinary routines of the household, a far more disturbing reality existed, one that Bernadette kept hidden for years. According to what later emerged in court, Scott Walker had been sexually abusing her repeatedly and deliberately, creating a secret fear that she carried quietly while still attending school, taking photos, laughing with friends, and appearing like any normal teenager trying to navigate life. She lived with that burden alone, unsure of who would believe her or what would happen if she spoke out. But in July 2020, Bernadette found a level of bravery that many adults never reach. She told her mother, Sarah Walker, exactly what had been happening, the truth she had buried for so long. Bernadette was not trying to bring chaos into the family. She wanted help. She wanted safety. She wanted someone to finally protect her from the pain she had been forced to endure. What she could never have imagined was that this moment, the moment she finally chose honesty over silence, would become the turning point that set a tragic chain of events in motion. A chain that would ultimately lead to her disappearance and to the heartbreaking end at the center of this case. On the 18th of July, 2020, Bernadette spent the day at her grandparents' home, a place where she usually felt relaxed and safe. It was supposed to be an ordinary visit, nothing unusual or concerning. Later that afternoon, her stepfather, Scott Walker, arrived to pick her up, an everyday action that had happened countless times before. A simple ride home, something so familiar that no one imagined anything could go wrong. But this routine moment, this quiet transition from one house to another, became the last confirmed time anyone saw Bernadette alive. She never made it home. She never walked through the front door, and the absence of her arrival immediately created a sense of unease that grew heavier with every passing hour. When she failed to return, concern spread quickly among those who knew her. Messages were sent repeatedly, hoping for a reply that never came. Calls were made, each one met with silence. And as the hours stretched into the night, that silence began to feel more and more troubling. Eventually, the worry became too great to ignore, and a missing person report was filed. What began as a strange delay suddenly transformed into a frightening mystery. Police launched a search, checking areas she was known to visit, speaking to people who might have seen her, and trying to retrace her last steps. But as the search widened, Bernadette seemed to disappear even further into uncertainty. It was as if she had slipped out of the world without leaving behind a single clear clue. No sightings, no belongings, no obvious trail. For investigators, it was as though she had simply vanished. And for her family, the not knowing became its own kind of torment. Scott and Sarah reported her disappearance on 21 July. Investigators responded with urgency, launching an extensive search effort that stretched across the community. They checked the home she might have visited, walked through the neighborhood she knew well, and examined every area where she could possibly have gone. Officers combed through fields, roadsides, pathways, and waterways, looking for any indication, however small, that might lead them toward her. Every potential clue was examined, every lead was followed, and every possibility was considered with growing desperation. But despite the intensity of the search, there was nothing. No physical evidence was recovered. No item belonging to Bernadette appeared. No scene offered answers. Her disappearance became more unsettling with each new day. because it was not simply a case of a teenager running away or hiding. It felt like she had vanished into absolute emptiness. Neighbors came forward, sharing anything they remembered, hoping to offer information that might help. Family members spoke to investigators, trying to piece together the timeline and make sense of what had happened. But the story never aligned into a clear picture. It remained broken, scattered, and painfully incomplete. Tension grew, confusion deepened, and the absence of answers created a shadow over the entire investigation. Everything felt suspended, as though the truth was hovering just beyond reach. And then, in the middle of all this uncertainty, something unexpected happened. Something that shifted the direction of the investigation entirely. Not long after Bernadette vanished, something unexpected began to unfold. Messages suddenly started coming from her phone messages, carefully worded to sound calm, reassuring, and completely in her voice. They painted a picture of a young woman who was alive, doing fine, and simply choosing to stay away for a while. But beneath that illusion was a much darker truth. Bernadette hadn't written a single one of those messages. Every text, every update, every attempt to make it look like she was safe came from her own mother, Sarah Walker. It was a deliberate decision, a desperate attempt to buy time, to hide the growing panic, and to mask the reality of what had already occurred. It wasn't just a lie. It was a full-scale cover-up, a deception so bold that it shocked even the investigators who had seen countless tragic cases before. And that decision, those crafted, misleading messages, would eventually lead Sarah straight into the arms of the justice system. Because the deeper detectives dug, the more the narrative began to fall apart. Timelines clashed, stories shifted, and the digital trail refused to stay quiet. Piece by piece, the truth started to break through the cracks. Detectives continued dissecting every layer of the case with careful patience. They analyzed the phone records, retraced movements, and rebuilt the timeline minute by minute. Scott Walker's behavior quickly became one of the most scrutinized elements of the investigation, not only what he did, but what he said. From the beginning, Scott insisted that Bernadette had simply jumped out of the car and ran off, claiming that the two had argued and she refused to return home. He repeated the story with a steady tone, as though hoping confidence would make it believable. He said she was angry, unpredictable, and determined to leave a narrative that painted her disappearance as her own choice. But when investigators compared his statement to the evidence, the story began to fracture. Digital footprints contradicted his version of events. Timelines refused to match. Witness details clashed with his explanations. And the more the detectives pressed, the more Scott's words began to shift. He adjusted small details, changed descriptions, tried to smooth over the cracks, but every adjustment created a new inconsistency. Soon, contradictions appeared at every turn. Phone data suggested movements that Scott never mentioned. Messages sent after Bernadette's disappearance did not match her usual tone. And through it all, there was still no trace of her anywhere. Piece by piece, the investigation built a narrative, one far more convincing than Scott's claims. The picture was not absolutely perfect, but it was powerful, coherent, and heavy with truth. And ultimately, it was enough. Enough for detectives to conclude that Scott Walker was not telling the truth. Enough for prosecutors to move forward. Enough to charge him with murder. When the case finally reached the courtroom in 2021, it sent shockwaves through everyone who had been following the story. The most haunting aspect was that Bernadette Walker's body had never been found. There was no tangible evidence of her final moments, no crime scene to point investigators toward the truth, and yet the weight of the case was undeniable. The prosecution presented a meticulous argument, combining digital evidence, behavioral analysis, and circumstantial proof to create a narrative that was as compelling as it was tragic. Every message, every movement, every contradiction in Scott Walker's accounts was pieced together to reveal the horrifying reality. Bernadette had disclosed the abuse she had endured for years, and in the shadow of that revelation, Scott Walker had acted on a desperate, terrifying fear of exposure. That fear, prosecutors argued, had driven him to commit the unthinkable. The jury listened intently as the evidence unfolded, presented systematically, layer by layer. They heard testimonies, examined timelines, and were shown the stark contrast between Scott Walker's carefully constructed stories and the truth revealed by the investigation. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Scott Walker was found guilty of the murder of Bernadette Walker. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 32 years, a punishment that reflected both the gravity of his actions and the depth of the betrayal. It was a verdict that carried enormous significance, not only for justice itself, but for the message it sent. Even in the absence of the most crucial piece of evidence, the human truth, when painstakingly uncovered, could prevail. Justice had been served, despite the silence that surrounded Bernadette's final moments. Sarah Walker, the mother of Bernadette, was also brought before the court in 2021. Her involvement in the case was unsettling yet crucial to understanding the full scope of the tragedy. During the investigation, it emerged that she had sent messages from her daughter's phone, deliberately creating the illusion that Bernadette was alive and safe. According to her own statements, she claimed her actions were meant to protect the family, to shield them from the chaos and scrutiny that followed her daughter's disappearance. However, the court saw through the justification. What she described as protection was, in reality, a calculated effort to mislead investigators and obscure the truth. Her actions were not viewed as innocent or misguided, but as a serious criminal attempt to pervert the course of justice. Sarah Walker was convicted and sentenced in 2021. Her sentence reflected the gravity of her choices and the role she played in attempting to conceal the reality of her daughter's fate. The tragedy of this family became painfully clear. A mother who lied, a stepfather who committed murder, and a life stolen far too soon. Bernadette Walker never returned home, and the family she once trusted became the very source of the devastation that consumed her final days. Bernadette Walker's disappearance and tragic death left an indelible mark on her family, friends, and the wider community. Her absence was felt in quiet homes, in schools, and on the streets where she had once walked freely, camera in hand, capturing the world she saw. Neighbors spoke of a young girl who had been thoughtful, creative, and full of promise. A life that should have unfolded with opportunity and hope. Her family, once whole, was fractured beyond repair. The betrayal by the people she should have trusted most, the stepfather who abused her and the mother who attempted to conceal the truth, created wounds that would never fully heal. For many, the most haunting aspect was the absence of her body. The silence that left unanswered questions lingering like shadows. Communities mourned, but they also reflected. Bernadette's story served as a stark reminder of the dangers of silence and the devastating consequences when abuse is hidden behind walls of secrecy and lies. Her life, though tragically cut short, became a symbol of courage, resilience, and the urgent need to listen to those who are suffering in silence. Thank you for watching. If you want more true crime stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.